Welcome everybody here at Kellogg College, and welcome everyone who's joining us from around the world virtually to this Bynum Tudor Lecture. So a special welcome to the latest recruit to our Bynum Tudor Fellowship, Lejeune Montgomery Tabron, the President and Chief Executive of the WK Kellogg Foundation. I'm delighted to say we've got another of our Bynum Tudor Fellows with us today as well, Dr. Ralph Walter, who's just flown in from Los Angeles today for the lecture. As is usually the case, the person who traveled the longest was the first to turn up, so thank you, Ralph. I should apologize perhaps for the slight delay in starting. This lecture was supposed to have started 2 years ago, but unfortunately it had to be delayed through a series of unfortunate events. But as always with Kellogg, everything seems to have turned out for the best, because the last public event we managed to hold here before lockdown was when we were recruiting the previously latest recruit to our Bynum Tudor Fellowship, who was His Royal Highness Prince Charles, who gave his lecture in here receiving the fellowship, and Dr. Ralph Walter had indeed flown in from Los Angeles that day to welcome him to the fellowship then as well. And Prince Charles said to us then what an honour it was to him to be made a fellow of this college. I'm not prompting you, Lejeune, that's just what he said. And he also said how wonderful it was that the fellows and students in sustainable urban development, an area that he had worked hard to get adopted as a master's program in a university, which then was Oxford, were collaborating with our fellows and students in evidence-based healthcare to create the Global Centre on Healthcare and Urbanisation, which his foundation was, he said, delighted to be supporting, and they do sponsor our public seminar series from that centre. And it was as a result of that visit and that speech he gave that we decided to create the Commission on Creating Healthy Cities, to think most immediately, how do we have urban areas that can deal with pandemics, but much more globally and generally, how can we design cities and urban areas to promote well-being more broadly? And I'd like to see we've got one of the commissioners, Kamal, with us in the audience, and that was generously funded again by Dr. Ralph Walter, our good friend Harry Liu, and the Prince's Foundation itself, and the McCall-McBain Foundation. And I'm delighted to say that Lejeune agreed to serve on the International Advisory Board for that Commission on Creating Healthy Cities, which was chaired by Lord Best, who will be launching the report next month in the House of Lords on Wednesday, July 13th. If anyone here hasn't had an invitation yet, let me know. I'm sure we can squeeze you in. And I do think that that report is incredibly impressive, the work that was done globally and in this country, and I think it really will have a very positive impact on society and well-being in this country, and I think more globally. Now, before welcoming Lejeune onto the stage, we're going to show a short video about the work of the WK Kellogg Foundation, so we'll watch that first.
A child's future is a precious gift. All children, families, and communities, regardless of race or income, should have the opportunity to reach their full potential. But across the world, systems founded in racism and bias shape our lives and close the door before some of us have even had a chance to explore the possibilities. Hello, I'm Lejeune Montgomery Tabron, President and CEO of the WK Kellogg Foundation. Last year, I shared with you the launch of our Racial Equity 2030 Challenge, which will award $90 million to fund bold solutions to drive an equitable future for children, families, and communities across the globe in the next decade. Since the launch, we have been heartened by the global nature of the response to the challenge, with ideas from nearly every part of the planet. These teams have immense potential for transformative change. Now, after a 5-month review process involving peers and experts from across the world, it's time to introduce the top 10 finalists for Racial Equity 2030.
We will build a movement for environmental justice,
creating regenerative food economies in Indian country,
inclusion, racial healing, and pride in heritage,
social and economic justice for all.
People of color have been segregated into lower paying restaurants and lower paying positions.
We have young people growing up experiencing trauma.
Racismo. O racismo está em todos esses problemas.
Our project could bring help on a big scale in a way that has never been tried before.
We invite all to join us on our last leg of our journey to make a better place for this world and hope for the future.
Racism is the problem. These teams and their bold solutions are the answer. Together we'll ensure the future of every child. Meet the finalists at racialequity2030.org.
Thank you very much for that. Now, Lejeun's kindly agreed to take questions at the end of her talk. So anyone joining us virtually, if you type your questions into the chat box, then we'll we'll pose your questions to the audience. Anyone here, just hold back until the end, and then we'll take your questions. So, Lejeune, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am so honored to be here today. I'd like to first thank you, President Mickey. I am so honored to be here at Kellogg College, and thank you to the University of Oxford for this opportunity today. I also want to acknowledge and thank Bynum Tudor Jr. and Mrs. Joanna Tudor, those who established this great award and great recognition for Kellogg College. And I am very deeply, deeply honored to join such a list of distinguished fellows from this great award. And as President Mickey said, it's been a long wait. I have waited, and I'm honored today to share my story and the story of the great work of the Wk Kellogg Foundation and the legacy and the work that I hope will continue as you've seen in the video today. So when I talk about the Wk Kellogg Foundation, I first start out by a saying that we say all the time. We say, it's not about me, and it's not about you. It's all about the children. And that is how we think of our work. And when I say that, I truly believe it because I think of myself as one of those children. And my story is about my journey from one of those children that we support to being able to stand here today and give you this lecture. So I'm going to start out with a little bit about my own childhood. And I say that my story is not unlike many of these children. And you'll see why I say that as I continue. But my own story begins with my parents. My parents, unfortunately, did not have access to opportunities. And so their journey was part of my journey. So I'm one of 10 children. That's going to be important as I talk about my journey. I'm actually number 9 of 10 children. And I'm also the 9th president of the WK Kellogg Foundation. So I'm sure you understand why number 9 is now my favorite number. But being number 9 in a family is an interesting position that will really shape who I am today. But I'll start with my parents. My parents were part of the Great Migration. And many of you may have heard of the Great Migration. It was a movement in the United States where over 6 million African Americans left the rural South of the United States, and they moved to urban Northeast, Midwest, and the West. So my parents did not have opportunities in Mississippi, and therefore decided that they were going to move to Detroit, Michigan, where they had heard that there were many opportunities because of the bustling auto industry. Thank goodness they were able to move. Some people do not have that mobility. Thank goodness that my parents were able to do so. I also think a lot about my mother as part of my journey, and think about that. She had 10 children, 10 natural children, no twins. And when I think about my mother, I say that she was probably one of the most calm and loving people I've ever met, with a strong sense of purpose and awareness of herself. I don't think I can probably remember very few times when she was even angry. She was just so pleasant and loving. And she taught me something that has been extremely valuable for me. And the greatest lesson that she taught me was she would always say to me, it's impossible to force an adult to do anything. And she was very clear about that. She told me, that you don't order an adult to do anything. Instead, she said, you can inspire an adult to take action. And you can be a powerful instrument in helping adults make the changes to improve their own lives and their children's lives. And she would continue to remind me that you have to befriend them, you have to engage with them, you have to inspire them, but you never force them. Brute power never works. And later I learned that what she was describing for me is referent power. And referent power is when someone builds trust and respect with one another and is a leader because of their strength and their relational skills. And that leadership is based on collaboration, and it's not based on command and control. And so that lesson was how my mother really led in our family, and it's really how I lead today. Focused on that collaboration, that trust building, and really thinking about what it takes to inspire others. So that's one lesson I had as a child. How do you kind of channel that referent power in your work? And the second thing I learned, again, being number 9 of 10 children, is how to be a team player. Because when you're number 9, of course, there's no positional power in that space. I have no authority, but yet I really learned in my family and on my team that I could be that loyal, trusted team player, and that would help me engage and negotiate and collaborate with others to get what I wanted. That was my only tool. So when I think about that team and my family unit, there's one particular person on the team that I wanted to share with you, and that's my sister Rita. So when I think about Rita, I think about my access to early childhood education. So I spoke about how it's difficult for people, particularly some most vulnerable, to have access to some of the greatest early childhood education. But I happened to have that. And I had it because I had a sister who was 5 years older than I was. She's number 8, I'm number 9, so there was this 5-year gap between us. But my sister would go to school every day, and then she would come home and say, let's play school. And she would teach me and number 10 everything she had learned in school. So before I could, barely walk and talk, I was a 5th grader. And I continued to learn from my sister as she continued her journey in education. And I just want to tell you how that made me feel, to go to school and be the top of my class, to teach all the other schools, all the other students, what I had learned from my sister. I remember I actually would have all the students line up because I could write in cursive in kindergarten. I would sign their names because I was the only one that could do so. But just think about the sense of confidence that that gave me as a student, because I always felt I was prepared and I knew what was happening. And unfortunately, there are many children who don't have access to that type of quality early childhood education. And in fact, my teachers would say that I was special. And I always would think, I'm not special. I just have caring, one-on-one tutorial education that I believe any child would benefit from. And any child that would have what I had, I know would be the scientists, the doctors, the lawyers, the great people that we need in our nation and the world to do great things and to be very innovative. So again, going back to my role at the WK Kellogg Foundation, where children is our focus, where we believe that every child should thrive, I lead this foundation with the passion of knowing that every child can thrive. And I'm one of those children. And I know that what we are doing at the Kellogg Foundation is so fundamental to what everyone should understand and participate in as far as improving the lives of the most vulnerable children. Another part of my childhood that is striking to me is in 1967. So I'm 5 years old, and we're right in the middle of the civil rights movement. And if you remember, in 1967 in Detroit, there was a rebellion. It erupted in our city, and I remember being in my home on the floor because my parents said we needed to take cover and try to be safe. But what strikes me today even is that rebellion was about lack of opportunities for people in Detroit. And it was also about police brutality. And they were rioting and demonstrating because they felt that they were being overly afflicted by the Detroit Police Department. And it was interesting that that event became a turning point for me in my life, because I started to see change in my community. My community had been one of those places that was very diverse. And it had many people who had migrated to Detroit for opportunity. And all of a sudden, my neighborhood only existed of families that looked like me. And then later I saw my high school, which was one of the best high schools in the city of Detroit. You actually had to make application to be admitted. It too went from a place of great diversity to almost 100% black. And that's okay, except the resources left as well. And the opportunity to really prepare students for full success wavered as well as the time went on. And then I entered the University of Michigan. 35,000 students, very few people of color. So I went from a place where I fit in, I looked like everyone else, to a place and an environment where I was an only. I was in a new environment, I had new awakenings, and it was a place where I didn't quite understand how to belong. But I knew what my mother had told me. So I knew I had a purpose and that I could be that loyal colleague and influence people in a way that would allow me to persevere and move forward. Soon after graduating from the University of Michigan, a course with an accounting bachelor's degree, 3 years later, I was invited to join the WK Kellogg Foundation. So that was in 1987, 35 years ago. Long time. I only feel like I'm 35 sometimes, but I guess I can't be. But when I went to the Kellogg Foundation, it was a place in transition. I started there as the controller, and at the time, most people of color were on contracts. They had time limits. I did not. I was the first one that was a full-time employee with no end date, except everyone then would ask me, how long are you going to be here? And I would say, I don't know. But I later realized it was because many had an end date. So I was the first that didn't have that end date, and it was an interesting place. And I would always tell people, I don't know, maybe I'll be here 5 years, and then I'll go on with my life. And here, 35 years later, I'm still so committed to this organization. It truly is my passion. But part of my ability to work in this organization for 35 years was really not only because of me. It was, again, understanding how to be a team player and having great sponsorship and support from many people throughout the organization, past presidents, people who really wanted to see the best in me and supported my journey in that regard. And so while there were many, many moments where I wanted to just quit, I just thought, this is hard. But I didn't, because I knew that our mission and our purpose was so solid and our work was undone. And I felt as long as I was there, I would be a part of making children thrive all over the world. And so I continue to lead with that type of energy and passion for what we do. So you saw the video. And the video, the tagline for the work that it described, Racial Equity 2030. It's a vision that we have at the WK Kellogg Foundation. But it's a vision because we know that for all children to thrive, that at the core of our work is to pursue racial equity so that all children have opportunities. And when we talk about pursuing racial equity, it's not about individuals or conflict. It's actually more about humanity and expressing what we believe as opportunities for all. And so here we are in the middle of this pandemic, 2020. And of course, I believe that during COVID-19, we did experience what shared fate is all about. All of a sudden, we were all intertwined and interconnected, and any person ill could have made all of us ill. But that type of shared fate is something that I believe extends much beyond COVID-19. And in fact, in the United States, we were also dealing with what we call multiple pandemics, and we had the murder of George Floyd that was shown all over the nation and the world. A brutality, again, took me back to 1967. It's like, wow, here we are again. But that, I believe, was a wake-up call for all of us. And we saw great awareness and response. We saw many corporations and organizations and people throughout the world begin to express an interest and a desire for greater equity and to reduce inequalities. And so at the Kellogg Foundation, we thought this isn't just a moment, maybe it's a movement. Maybe there's something we can do at the Kellogg Foundation to support this time period where people are interested in learning and understanding and taking action, which is what we were so incredibly willing to support at that time. And again, before I go on, I just want to explain how we define racial equity, because one thing that we saw is everyone began using these terms, but there wasn't a common definition. In fact, these were trigger words for some people, and they didn't even want to hear the words. But at the Kellogg Foundation, we were very clear that it was just about everyone being able to see themselves as having access to our opportunity regardless of their color, their religious belief, or their gender. It was simple as that. It wasn't a black-white thing, and just when we look in this room, we know our nation and the world is not black-white. It's a beautiful color, a fabric of humanity. And that's what we wanted to promote in our racial equity work, that this was about humanity, coming together, finding our commonalities, and doing the work so that everyone can thrive and every child can then thrive. But it was interesting because as we thought about the pursuit, we knew that in order for there to be racial equity in the world, that there needed to be racial healing. That part of being an equitable society is the healing that we must all be a part of as it relates to our own journeys in this world and how all of us have experienced racial equity in the past. And so again, we sat down and we wanted to envision what could be the new narrative. How can you create racial equity? What needs to happen? How can we heal together? How can we bring people together to heal? And one thing we knew as well, that racial equity is a part of looking at systems. It isn't a part totally of actions, but it's about what are the systems that intentionally or unintentionally create disparities. Again, we saw COVID-19 create disparities. We know the disease didn't see color, but the systems that we've been living in resulted in those with less opportunities being more affected by COVID-19 and dying from the disease than others. We also know, because of our work, that educational systems do not allow for the type of equity. Financial services, I could go on, housing, etc. And what we said is there has to be some time where people can think about what a new narrative could be in this space. Systems are created by people. Systems, you know, there are some natural systems, but the rest are man-made. And the ones that create the disparities that we see are man-made. So knowing that these systems existed, how do we encourage people to improve those systems for their own communities, for their own children, and their own families? And that was a journey and the vision we had for Racial Equity 2030. We wanted it to be global because some of these systems are global. They produce the same results in many locations across the nation and the world. And so we wanted to engage with people and to inspire them to be as bold as they could be to create new systems, systems that work for everyone. And at this time, I just want to share with you some of the stories that we are learning as we have come to these 10 finalists. So in Tanzania, indigenous pastoralist women and community have been losing their ancestral lands. They're constantly under attack due to neo-colonial and racialized prejudice systems. And so within this context, indigenous women and girls are disproportionately affected in these areas. So as they think about their social norms, what they know is that women and girls are limited in their economic independence and their power to access and control productive resources. So they submitted a proposal that would be about meaningfully including women and girls in the decision-making around all levels of their rights and their lands. That was very interesting to us. We know that land is critical for many, many communities. And then we went to Mexico. And there are indigenous communities in Mexico's Central and South America. They're chronically poor, politically marginalized, and suffer gross racial discrimination. And again, what we learned is they're denied their land rights. And because of the injustice around their land rights, they're unable to really have legal title of their land, and it renders them powerless to defend the land. Another story, agriculture and food represents the primary economy for Native nations, and they serve as the conduit by which Native people preserve their increasingly threatened homelands. The lack of investment in Native solutions and the federal encumbrance of Indian lands is something that we must think about, and it affects their ability to have regenerative food sources and food economies. Again, a body of work long overdue. And what they were hoping to do together is to create opportunity for creating new systems where they can have food and agriculture for their communities. In Hawaii, youth of color are disproportionately represented in the justice system. So this was about eliminating incarceration of youth in Hawaii. And this story is about how they want to come together and build restorative practices so that the young people have a pathway that leads them to culturally grounded alternatives. And then in Brazil, racism in Brazil prevents black quilombola, I love saying that word, quilombola and indigenous students from accessing their right to an equitable and quality education. The education is deeply segmented by race in Brazil and socioeconomic status. And so the children in the Quilombos are more likely to drop out, have higher exclusion rates, and lower educational attainment. They want to build an equitable education system for the young people in Brazil. Migrant workers have been most vulnerable to labor exploitation. They're denied their fundamental human rights, and they suffer from low wages. And today, many migrant workers are victims of wage theft, as they call it, where they work a full day's labor, a full week's worth, and then at the end, they're told that they're not going to be paid, and they have no recourse because they don't have rights. But this is happening all over the nation and the world. Imagine leaving the place where you're born because you want more opportunity. You want opportunities to live and thrive, and then you move to a place where that exists. I spoke about my own family, but Latinos in the United States have similar stories. They come to the United States and they're largely unrecognized, and they're often not able to have their homes and their countries be a part of their new journey. They face severe economic and social disparities, and this particular request was about closing the opportunity gap for Latinos in the United States. In Chicago, a 16-year-old named D'Angelo asked a simple question: why is my community being hit the hardest? And of course, he even knew what the answer was. He talked about lack of resources in his community, persistent challenges by Black and brown youth, and the systemic racism that he had witnessed around housing, education, etc. Again, the proposal is about bringing youth into the conversation and allowing them to create solutions in their own communities. They see the issues, they have the answers. And finally, wage. Particularly in the restaurant industry, wages, the structure that's used for paying people in the restaurant industry is very similar to slavery structures that existed during slavery. So thinking about how people have to work and live off tips, which are very unpredictable, and it doesn't allow them the professionalism of their career and their pathways as others may do in other careers. So we have a recommendation to professionalize the restaurant industry and to begin to think about how there could be better structures for pay so that they can be proud of their profession and their industry, and again, characterize the industry in one that is looking forward. So one of the most devastating and uneven distributions of impact in our communities is environmental harm. And we were interested in this proposal that talks about the worldwide effects of pollution, deforestation, and displacement. And it's interesting that most of these areas are concentrated in communities of color. And again, this proposal is about allowing people in those communities to be a part of the decision-making process when these decisions are made where this happens across the nation. Today, they are not a part of the decision-making at all, but they clearly are affected by the outcomes of the environmental harm and the exposure to the pollutants. So if you listen to all of these stories, all of these great ideas that we received, what we realized, the children and the families are all the same across all of these places. They all just want their everyday experience to be fruitful. They want to experience well-being in a society where they matter and they have opportunities. And it's interesting that you've probably heard of systems that you've heard of before. These were not new systems, but somehow these systems are still standing in the way of our children and families to thrive. And so what we wanted to do at the Kellogg Foundation was fuel their energy, their passion. And at the Kellogg Foundation, we help people help themselves. These were their ideas. This is their journey. And we wanted to provide resources. So each of these proposals received $1 million to further develop their ideas, to make sure, even in our process, that there was no inequity in the resources they had to even submit the proposal. And after receiving $1 million each and further developing their work, 5 of them will be finalists. And as you heard, they'll be announced later this year. And those 5 finalists will receive between $20 and $10 million each to further execute and take action against this great work. We are truly honored to support this work, and we know it isn't easy. So we've committed to work with them for a decade, and that's where the 2030 comes from. They will receive resources for the next decade to truly pursue their actions and their passions for the great work that they can see and the passion to address some of these systems with bold solutions that engage community. And one of the things we believe at the Kellogg Foundation is people have the inherent capacity to improve their own lives. We don't tell them what to do. They know what to do. They have the answers, and they have the love and the desire for their communities. And we wanted to fuel that. And finally, what we know, and as we think about this work, is not just these 10. We know that one foundation is only one foundation. We're not going to do this work alone. We know that we have to engage people all over the world. People who want to build a better future for their children, their grandchildren, and their grandchildren's grandchildren. And so we know that a lot of this work happens locally. It's about people in their own communities doing their own things. So as I close, I just want to speak to all of you, because at the end of the day, it's people, right? It's leadership. It's that referent power that we all have to take action, to influence others, to be a part of the solution that ends with all of our children thriving. And all I can say is, as I close, just think about what it would look like if every child truly had opportunity. What it would mean for economic opportunities around the nation and the world. And for us at the Kellogg Foundation, we think about this every day. And finally, when I've named all these wonderful things, and I haven't named what I think about today as kind of the elephant in the room, and that's child safety. And right now in the United States, as we continue to see children being massacred in their school buildings, there is work that absolutely needs to be done in this space to protect our children. And I want to end with a quote from Mr. Kellogg, because he would always, this quote I've said many, many times, and it's never been more relevant than what I felt like today as I think about what's happening with our young people and gun violence. But Mr. Kellogg said he wanted to help children everywhere face the future with confidence, with health, and with strong rooted security in their trust of this country and its institutions. And I think today, whether we children believe in their institutions and whether they have trust in their institutions, as Mr. Kellogg wanted. And I believe that for them to trust in their institutions, they have to trust in the adults. And we are the adults. And while I can't tell an adult to do anything, I know that, but I would ask that together we can make a difference for the children of the future, and that we together create a world where all people, regardless of their racial, ethnic group identification, skin color, or physical traits, deserve an equal opportunity to experience well-being in a just society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lejeune. That's absolutely magnificent. So we've got some time for questions. If I can throw it open. Yeah.
I love the ideas that came forward. I think they're incredibly difficult to do, though. I was really wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you think they will be actually executed.
Yes. And to say a little bit about that, I'll share with you a little bit about the process. So there was a jury curated to look at these proposals, and the jury represented people from all over the world. And we actually looked at over 1,400 proposals from 72 countries. And this jury, one of the major criteria was, is this actionable? It must be actionable. And for every last one of these proposals, while they are very complicated, there were actionable steps that could be taken. So for example, when you speak about people who were losing their land rights and were not able to advocate for themselves, the actual action would be to begin to train paralegals who understand land rights and understand how in certain communities and locations the advocacy can grow, and we could equip people who were losing their rights to be more knowledgeable and active in the legal pursuits that they were having. So people did come up with very creative, actionable solutions for every proposal that was presented.
Thank you. Have we got any questions from our virtual audience? Yeah?
Yes, we do. So Stephen Ruth has put in the chat, do you believe that reparations are needed to help achieve racial equity? If so, what are the parameters? If not, why not?
Mm-hmm. That's a very active question, I would say. Everyone, I think, has an opinion on that. I don't believe it's an either-or solution. I think a lot of times in this conversation, we're pushed to these extremes. You either have to do this or it has to be that. I think there's somewhere on the continuum of how you support people as they are needing access to opportunities that they've been denied. I happen to be a part of a body of work that we've supported that is about thinking about the descendants of all the slaves who were sold in order to create Jesuit education institutions in the United States. And there were some people who said, you know, there needed to be reparations. There were others, and the actual work that I'm involved in is to set up more of a foundation or trust that would work on the systems so that these opportunities will become more open and available, as well as thinking about the descendants themselves and making sure that they were well. So it's a combination of that, and I don't like to get into these either-or debates. I think the most important thing is to acknowledge that the systems are preventing people from access, and how do we dismantle these systems and the hierarchy of racism that continues to perpetuate inequality.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Thiago. I'm from Brazil. You pronounce quilombola very well.
Thank you.
Actually, one of my great-grandmas was a quilombola. The rest of the family wasn't. But I understand very well what you're saying. And I completely agree what you said about it's not either or. Those issues are very complex. And growing up in Brazil, attending like the worst state schools, like not the best like you did, it was, people would like to bring the attention to that kid that succeeds, but the system is rigged against them, as you said very well. So I think it's very important to start with grassroots organizations, but is the Kellogg Foundation working towards more equitable systems in general with governments? Because as you said, there is not just one way. So what are you doing, or are you doing something in relation to supporting state initiatives as well to transform and make like the educational system more equal for every child?
Yes. Thank you for that question. And, you know, if I had had all the time, I would have gotten into that a little bit more. But actually, a lot of these proposals are public-private partnerships. And again, when you think about how they are actionable, we totally believe that collaboration and leveraging both local knowledge and skill set as well as governmental entities is critical to getting this work done. And a lot of these proposals include those types of public-private partnerships. So absolutely. particularly, some of you may have noticed we do a lot of work in Haiti. And when you think about your question, and we think about, for example, what an educational system in Haiti could look like when there basically is no government. And what we've been able to help produce is what we call the model school system. That includes those people who are providers of education, the different systems at play. So there's the Catholic system, there's kind of a charter, for lack of a better word, system. There's a public system that's almost not funded at all. There's a Ministry of Education, but no resources. But to bring them together, as well as residents and people in community, to think about what are the key elements of education that should exist regardless of the system or the structure. And there's actually a collaboration with the University of Quisqueya to create that and make the university the anchor institution to perpetuate and sustain that kind of a structure. So yes, absolutely, we know we can't do this without the systems and the institutions in different locations.
Right, thank you. I think we've got another from our virtual audience.
Yes, thank you. This question comes from Kareem Haji, and the question is...
Oh, sorry, actually, Kareem's actually joined us in person, so if you take
Okay.
yeah, can you take the microphone round here? Kareem, do you want to put your hand up? You can ask in real life.
So thank you for your lecture and also for your sharing your personal story. I think that was very powerful. So my question is really around, you talked about these initiatives and a 2030 timeline. So it's not a lot of time, but also it relates to the question around data and measurement. So what are you learning about how we might need to count things a little bit differently or measure things differently in order to get at the kind of things that you're talking about? Because both equity as well as children is multi-generational timelines. There's lots of things that don't get counted or are not visible. So what are you learning or what do you hope to see? And what's the role that people like us at a university can also play in supporting that agenda?
Thank you very much. And I want to start by recommending that you go to our website, and we've actually recently published a publication on how to conduct evaluation with a racial equity lens. And I think it reflects our learnings over many years and understanding the complications there. But there's, there's a lot of recent conversation around how you democratize data. And that is something that is fundamental in the publication that we've recently produced. But it talks about who owns the data, who decides what the questions are. Are the questions quantitative? Are they qualitative? How do you disaggregate the data and not report the high-level trends? And what we've learned is it takes all of that. And particularly how you engage community in this work. So I'll tell you some of our own learnings. We used to hire thoughtful leading evaluators, and then we would send them into our communities to try to learn things. And we later learned from the community that every evaluator isn't created equally. And without trust building, we don't know how reliable the data is. And so we now understand, and if you look at we still hire many evaluators, but we're more conscious of how they relate to their the projects that they're looking at. And there needs to be a connection, and if there isn't, we support that, and we engage with them first before it is just this study. And again, the community has to be very much involved in what results look like. So, you know, we may say that we want every child to thrive, which we do, and we have a whole series of data that tells us whether children are thriving, like, you know, are they ready for kindergarten? Are they reading by 3rd grade? So there are some measures that we look at, but we also look at things like, you know, are their parents stable? Are, you know, what does absenteeism look like? You know, all the metrics that we learn from community, that if these kind of indicators are not there, you're going to miss understanding the dynamic and what support even looks like. So we've learned a lot in this space. We have our publication, I think, is rich with ideas and ways to think about it, but just know that we know that it's very complex and is not a simple data gathering effort.
Great, thanks very much. There's a question at the back there. Yeah, thanks for waiting the mic, because otherwise the online people can't hear the questions.
Thank you, President Tabron. That was such an amazing talk. And I also realized that here at the college, we're not asking the easiest questions. So thank you for responding to them in such a genuine way. You mentioned the importance of private and public partnership. Yeah. And I'm wondering, what are some of these bi-directional collaborations between the foundation and Kellogg? Because as we all know, there's so much potential for the food industry to make positive and genuine changes, especially for a foundation and a company this size. There's so many internal stakeholders, and I'm sure, like, yeah, can you share your expertise working in that?
Great, thank you for your question. And so let me start out by saying, wow, the Kellogg Company was created by Wk Kellogg. He created great wealth from the Kellogg Company, and then he took all of his wealth and he created the Kellogg Foundation as a totally separate entity, separate and distinct with separate boards and separate missions. And there are many times when the Kellogg Foundation, in our pursuit for well-being and for children to thrive, where we may have a totally opposite position of the Kellogg Company. And, you know, Mr. Kellogg wanted them to function in their own capacity and we function in ours. And in that case, our pursuit has always been about well-being and for children to thrive. And, you know, sometimes sugar isn't the best for children to thrive. We've said that, we know that, we understand that, and our work may be, we had a whole childhood obesity initiative that was about well-being, and sometimes that work is collaborative, sometimes we may be very different in our views.
Great, thanks very much. Well, I'm afraid we've run way over time, but maybe have one more question. Yeah, can we get the mic there for one more question? I'm sorry, it's Tabron Lejeune is at 4 for giving such a fascinating lecture. But last question then.
Thank you, Lejeune. It was really interesting for me to hear your story and to know more about the Kellogg Foundation. You talked about systems change, and I think if we talk about systems change, we have to talk about power. Much power resides in institutions, so decision-making power, power over resources. And more often than not, that power is in the hands of white people. I know the Kellogg Foundation has made huge inroads in this way. I wonder what other institutions can learn from Kellogg.
That's a great question. Two things come to mind to answer your question. The Kellogg Foundation has been on its own journey. It's not as if our journey hasn't been complicated and long as well. And part of our own journey was to address those issues internally, because we believe that, you know, if we are practicing what we preach on these issues, that we can be better partners in community. So for issues of power, for example, we restructured our organization and kind of removed the hierarchy of power and created a networked organization with multiple leaders, many leaders, leaders that are more closer to the work, trying to eliminate that, but understanding both the complications of that and how to live into it and be bold in that. So we've made a lot of internal changes. And then the second part of that relates to what has happened in philanthropy during the pandemic. Philanthropy has been challenged extremely critically during these past few years. And as we were really wanting to help and support community during the pandemic, what they were telling us was, you know, and some have even been bold enough to say, you can keep your money if it comes with all these reports and you're telling us this and we got to do this by this date. We're trying to save lives and we don't have time for your bureaucracy and you coming in and pushing down your agenda on us. So it made us pause. And during the pandemic, we eliminated all of our grant-making rules. We turned all of our grants to general operating support, and we basically said, we trust in you, that's why you're a grantee, do what you need to do. And it's taught us a valuable lesson about the power that we play, that we have to give up in order to learn and actually engage and give community the voice and the seat at the table that they need to thrive. So that's work that we're continuing to do.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I'd like to thank our virtual audience for joining us. I'm sorry you can't join us for the next bit, which is continue the discussion and questions over drinks on the terrace, but hopefully next time. But before, so get your drinks, join us at the terrace, and before you do, please join me in thanking Lejeune Montgomery Tabron, because I said Tabron, for an absolutely fascinating lecture, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.